This demonstration is going to show us how to do a reductive technique. So we've got our printing plate, we've got our template, and we've mixed up a pretty strong purple. So I've got the blue and the quinacridone violet, and it's a pretty intense blue-violet. We're going to cover this whole area. You want to try to get a nice even tone. Any variations, like if you've got some thin patches, that may show up in the final image if you're not careful. So do your best to try to put a thin layer, but try to get it nice and even so that there's not lighter splotches anywhere in the image. And then we're going to do a variety of things. So we're going to stencil out some areas with paper that I've already pre-cut. And we're also going to do some hand-drawn reduction techniques. So one thing you can do is use like the tip of a skewer or any sort of dull pencil, and you can just draw into the image to create white lines. Now you notice some areas the ink's getting globbed up a little bit, so that's going to get worse and worse if you've got a really thick coverage of ink, or if you don't wipe off your skewer occasionally, it just sort of deposits little globs. If you don't like that, you can take a few marks, kind of wipe off the skewer, and clean it occasionally so that you're not building up big puddles of ink. If the ink's too thick, it's just going to blob out again when we go to print it. So try to keep the ink nice and thin. Another thing you can do is you can use textures that you press into the plate. So this is just a crumpled piece of lightweight paper, and it will pick up some softer patterns of ink here. And the more you blot it, the more ink will be removed in those areas. So that's kind of a nice way to get some softer textures that aren't quite so line-based. The other thing we can do is we can grab a piece of like a t-shirt, scrap of t-shirt, and wrap it around our fingers. If you want a nice clean shape, you can lift that out. You can, maybe blot some areas here that got a little bit too heavily inked, and create some little soft marks there. So you can take things like a scrap of mat board, drag it across. We're just trying to get a lot of variety here. So at this point we're just doing a lot of experimentation to see what kind of materials create what kind of marks. I don't really have an image in mind on this one. And then the other thing that works really well is to cut some thin stencils. This is just a piece of the parchment paper that I cut into a shape, and we can bring those in from a different area too. So I'll just lay it on there, and the ink holds it pretty well in place, so you don't need to worry about it blowing around too much. Let's just put a couple of those in there to kind of break up the negative shapes a little bit. And then be sure to clean up your borders or put down your little transparent frame to clean up the edges of the image. I don't think I'll even bother to tape this one down since I'm only doing a single color print. I don't really need to be able to reposition it later. So let's clear a few of these things out of the way. And we're ready to print. So we've got our thin washi paper, and you decide whether you want to lay it smooth side down or rough side down. I kind of like the slightly grainy texture, so I'm going to put the little bit rougher side down. Line up the edge of the paper, drop it into position. And here I definitely do want to use my parchment paper. I've already torn a couple of my really delicate sheets of printing paper, so let me pause just for a second while I get some parchment paper. Okay, I'm back. I found a piece of parchment paper. I'm going to tape it down since I do want to be able to check my progress on this. I'll just tape it here at the top edge. And then I'm going to burnish really nice and hard. I want all of the image to transfer at this point, so I'll go back to using my wooden spoon and just go over every inch of this. I'll pause again. I mean, this takes 3 or 4 minutes, so rather than have you watch me do the whole thing, what I'll be doing is going over the whole thing in 3 or 4 directions, really pressing as hard as I can with the smooth side of the spoon. Do make sure you've got some sort of barrier so that you don't rip this really delicate washi paper. I'll be right back. Okay, I've been burnishing now for 2 or 3 minutes. I want to work a little bit more carefully around these stencils. They tend to be, depending on the thickness of the paper of the stencil, you might end up with a little bit of a fuzzy edge around those shapes. But let's go ahead and take a peek. We're going to flip the burnishing paper out of the way, and then we're down to our printing paper. And I think it worked okay. Again, not super exciting, but I'm going to show you another demo in a minute here where we overprint with a complement. So this might be a good exercise to show that technique. So we've used the reductive technique. We've used the skewer, if you remember, for the real fine line work. You can see how where the areas where it globbed up around the edges of the line, it's sort of flattened out into kind of a wide blob of color. That's one more reason to maybe use a really thin layer of ink here. The same thing happened where I'd use the mat board scrap to push the ink out of the way. At the edges it does deposit a thicker layer there, so you may like that or you may not, but if you don't like that much of a thick layer at the edges, you could be wiping off that scrap of mat board in between strokes to try to minimize that. But I kind of like that it gave us a little bit darker value there. I think it's fine. And then these are where we put the parchment paper stencils on the edges. These marks were done with a piece of t-shirt wrapped around my finger. So I'm going to save this one for our next print. We're going to add a different color. So I think since we've already done some primary color mixing, I think we're going to do a complement on this next one. So this is kind of a purpley blue. I'm going to choose a color that's kind of opposite on the color wheel, and we'll overprint it and see if we can get some neutral browns.